Formally welcome. I want to formally welcome everyone to this AABA webinar on publicly engaged biological anthropology. My name is Rob O'Malley. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a public engagement associate in the Personal Genetics Education Project based at Harvard Medical School. And I also serve as the AABA Education Committee co-chair and organizer of this webinar. And just very glad for all of you to join us and to our speakers who have made time in their days to share with us. This meeting is recorded and will be posted on the AABA YouTube channel. We will be having a interactive breakout rooms at the end. That part will not be recorded. And the closed captioning is available if you use the link at the bottom of your screen. You can activate that. So as we know, the field of biological anthropology encompasses a range of fascinating but often socially contested topics and issues, such as human origins and evolution, genetics, race and racism, sex, gender, and sexuality, and other dimensions of human difference. Some elements of the discipline, including common practices of fieldwork and local collaboration, or lack thereof, continue to reinforce harmful patterns of behavior that are grounded in colonialism, racism, and Eurocentrism. The US and the world at large face a social climate of growing polarization and distrust of science and scientists, and in some cases, active political censorship and sanction around issues of science and health. So what we're exploring today in this webinar is, given these challenges, how can biological anthropologists engage with their students and with diverse communities about the work of our discipline in ways that are inclusive, equitable, just, and impactful? I'll be introducing our speakers momentarily, but I just want to reiterate how very grateful I am for their time and attention in joining us here today. So this is our agenda. This is intended to be an interactive webinar. After a brief introduction, which is what we're in now, we'll move to hear from our three fantastic speakers who are sharing their time and insights with us today, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. We will also have a dedicated Q&A at the end, which I will moderate. Questions should be submitted, I believe, through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, unless Brett corrects me.
I'm correcting you only because
okay.
When we switch this over to being a meeting instead of a webinar, we're Q&A buttonless now, so we're going with the chat.
Okay. Yes, thank you for that correction. I realized I didn't see it, so yeah. So just use the chat to submit questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. We will have an opportunity for folks to share and learn in breakout rooms and to share their reflections and perspectives on a shared Google Jamboard, and we will share a link in chat a little bit later. And we'll conclude with just a few minutes of sharing out after those breakout rooms. Just as a reminder, this is a professional setting. The AABA Code of Conduct does apply, and I think Brett will post that in chat. In essence, we want to treat this as a space free of harassment or any form of abuse, a safe place for people to share and to learn. We encourage you, particularly in the discussions and Q&A, to share the time and space, to recognize that there may be disagreement, but if that emerges, to engage with curiosity rather than judgment, to try to speak from your own experience, as opposed to speaking on behalf of a group or a demographic. And also to just respect confidentiality. People may share personal stories or reflections, and just not to attribute that, attribute anything specific to people by name without their permission. I also wanted to just highlight that the AABA meeting is in Los Angeles coming up in March, and I hope to see many of you there. There is an abstract deadline later this week, February 1st, for the Committee on Diversity Undergraduate Research Symposium. So many of you, or maybe your students, that's something to be aware of. And while the full meeting schedule is forthcoming, there have already been announced a fantastic array of events and workshops that many of which are aligned with the topic of today's webinar. This includes an art, culture, and science engagement exhibition organized by Dr. Michelle Bisenson and myself, which is an extension of last year's Unsymposium. And we are actively seeking submissions, so if that's of interest, please check that out. Other workshop topics include public science communication on social media, improv, humor, science writing, dealing with bad faith pushback and trolls, to name just a few topics. So just a really exciting meeting and many other topics as well, many other worthy topics as well. So you can learn more about that at the AABA website. If you have any questions about the exhibition in particular, please reach out to me. I see a question about whether there's a hybrid meeting option. I believe that there are some hybrid options, but not the entire meeting. And you can check those details out at the AABA website. So with that, let's move on to our first speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Catherine Katie Ranhorn, who is an assistant professor and research scientist at the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University. With a commitment to stewarding the deep history of human evolution through collaborative paleoanthropology, her extensive fieldwork since 2008 reflects her dedication to community-based research. She maintains long-term connections at field sites in Tanzania and Kenya, fostering partnerships in heritage management, conservation, and community archaeology. And she also directs the Ancient Technology Lab, Deep History Lab, and Archaeological Science Lab at ASU. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ranhorn.
All right, thank you, Rob. Let me see if I can get this up and running here. Can everyone see my slides and not presenter mode? Okay. Oopsie. Just trying to get my notes, but that may not be possible. Okay, well, I wanted to start by first thanking you, Rob, and the rest of the AABA Education Committee for organizing this, and the staff at the Burke Incorporated for helping to arrange this. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak with you all today about some of my work, what I'm calling cultivating community-centered research. One second. Let me turn off my presenter mode and see if that works. Okay, never mind. I'll have to do this without my notes. That's okay. So I've been asked to talk about community-centered research, and I have about 12 minutes to do that. And so I've decided to focus today on more of a kind of Cliff Notes version of how I see this practice as really a long-term cultivation practice. And if I were an undergraduate or a graduate student, what are some of the things that I wish someone had told me in trying to start this work? I also wanted to say that I'm looking forward to learning from you all, and also learning from the fellow panelists, Elaine Guevara and Esha Lewis. And I'm looking forward to speaking about some of these concepts in more detail with all of you in the breakout session. So this is necessarily broad strokes. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about I'll basically give a review of some of the resources to give you a sense of the shoulders that I'm standing on, and also to give folks some resources that they can dig more deeply into. And then I'll be speaking very briefly about some of the lessons that I've had the privilege to learn working in central Tanzania. I've worked in Eastern Africa since 2008, and I want to say that I am by no means the sole driver of some of the work that's presented here today. And I also wanted to say that all of the photos that I'll be sharing are shared with permissions, and also there are no photos of human remains. Okay, so I think the people in this audience probably already largely agree with this concept. So I won't spend too much time on this. This is really some of the why should we think about community-centered research. One of those reasons, or one framework, is the idea that biocultural heritage is a fundamental human right. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Florida, I was exposed to some of these concepts through anthropology more broadly, particularly from Peter Schmidt, who I've highlighted here on the left, who has a chapter about this topic in a volume called Plundering Africa's Past. So that was something that was very influential for me early on. And I also wanted to highlight Professor Seda Meyer's work, who has written about the concept of cultural heritage as a basic human need in many places. And so this is one reason that we can think about why communities are important in thinking about biological anthropology. And another framework to consider is especially when we're thinking about biological anthropology. I was thinking the other day about, what biological anthropologists do day to day, and what are the roles of communities in that work. And to me, communities are really essential in stewarding both the cultural and natural resources that make our work possible. So whether you're dealing with non-human primate behavior in biology, modern and past human biology, material culture, or thinking more about the contextual data, really, I think everyone in bioanth is integrated with local indigenous and descendant communities to some extent. And so just from a fundamental perspective of stewardship, we really need to be thinking about how we can center communities more in our work. And again, to give you a sense of the shoulders that I'm kind of standing on here, Jane Goodall started a program called the Takari Program, which is really the foundation of the Jane Goodall Institute, which is a community-based conservation program at Gombe. And that's just one example, which really influenced my work. It is a Tanzanian example as well. And then, of course, Mary Leakey, who had worked at Olduvai Gorge for many years, was very influential in creating what was the Olduvai Site Museum and engaging local communities there and some of the findings that they found, some of the fossil hominins. And so for me, starting out as an undergraduate working in Tanzania, I had big shoes, I think, to fill. And I was also very fortunate to have several other resources available to me. This book on the left, Community Archaeology and Heritage in Africa, edited by Peter Schmidt and Innocent Pickere, is one that I can recommend for folks who are interested in this kind of work, particularly in Africa. Sonia Adelaide, I don't have enough time and space today to talk about her tremendous contribution to Indigenous and collaborative archaeology. So I will put this volume here and highly encourage people to consider that. And then also another volume that I will be drawing from a little bit later is by Supernaut, Baxter, Lyons, and Adelaide, titled Archaeologies of the Heart. And so these are just a few of the resources. And again, we are talking about 30 plus years of literature in the community-centered, community collaborative, and community-based participatory research within anthropology. And I really didn't think I could do it justice to try to do a review of that in 12 minutes. So these are just some of those resources. And I also encourage people, if they know of other resources, to consider putting those into the chat. Okay, so one of the first questions that we can think about when we're talking about community-centered research is really thinking about which community are we talking about. I've put this here as an example of some of the communities that I integrate and am in relation with regularly. The sort of larger circle is the Machinjioni village community. And that is really the community where I put, I would say, most of my investment of time and energy. So I like to think about kind of increasing levels of, increasing scales of complexity. So in the work that I do in stewarding sort of the material culture side of biological anthropology, we deal with a lot of rock shelters and excavations, which tend to be quite localized on the landscape. And so the community that really makes the most sense to, I think, prioritize are the people who live directly next to where those resources might be located. So in this case, it's about 100 people who identify as Rangi and are largely farmers. There are some pastoralists as well. And so that's one community that lives in this area. There are several other communities as well that I won't go into too much detail today, but largely our work has focused on Machinjiuni village. I've also listed the Kola Museum and Antiquities here. That's more of a Tanzanian government group of people who are concerned primarily with the preservation of the sites. We also work with the forestry division, and in some cases, there are people at the village level who might also be represented at the museum, for example. So there are, instances where there's overlap, and then there are instances where there's not as much overlap. For example, the broader academy. That's something that I hope through conversations like this, that's a gap that we can make smaller over time and hopefully make some of these circles overlap a little bit more. And then of course, there's, the greater public community. And so I think it's important to always think about, which community are we talking about? And I also wanted to draw attention to this very important paper Christina Douglas and colleagues published on their research in Madagascar, particularly this figure that I think highlights very well. Collaboration is a process. It's not something that happens really overnight. It takes a lot of time and personal investment. And what you can see here from left to right is time, and the Morombe archaeological project, the levels of collaboration that they have been able to maintain, starting from the left when they were really getting started, there wasn't as much collaboration. And you can see that there are also different steps in the research process, from project development to the fieldwork to the analysis to the output. And I think a lot of us are hoping to move towards what they have here on the right, which is a fully collaborative, fully co-produced model. And accepting that some of us are just not quite there yet, but that's definitely where we are trying to get to. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the lessons that we've learned working in Kondoa. So for folks who are not familiar, can you see my mouse? No? Yes?
We can, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so Tanzania is highlighted here in yellow. And we're here in the central part of the country where this kind of north-south escarpment is called the Orangi Escarpment. And this escarpment is really adorned with hundreds of rock art sites. And so that's what's really attracted attention for a long time. This little dot is one of those sites. It's a locality historically known as Kisese 2, and it's located, like I mentioned, in Machinjiuni village. So most of our efforts over the last 8 years have focused primarily at that particular locality. There are hundreds of other sites here, and I think that takes a lot of work to continue to develop the rapport with all of those communities. So I'll be focusing really on this one area. Oh, and I wrote here in Swahili, Tujijenge. I'll talk a little bit more about language in a minute, but this basically translates to we build ourselves. And so it's a reflexive meaning in the fact that, we can't really depend on other people. And to go back to this idea of cultivation, community is something that we cultivate and that we build. Okay, so the Kisese 2 rock shelter, to me, is an incredibly important, significant place. We know that the archaeological deposits there span over 50,000 years. And like I mentioned previously, this area is known for its abundant and diverse ancient agro-pastoralist rock paintings. It has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Center. It is a popular area for tourists to visit. You can see here this photo that I took kind of standing up above the site. This down here is where the rock shelter is located, where the rock paintings are located. And this is really the Maasai steppe, and this is the continuation of that escarpment where we see rock paintings and archaeological sites all up and down this area. And these are just some examples of the rock art sites that we find today. So these are some new ideas that I'm sharing today. I wanted to think about, what is sort of the life cycle of a community-centered project, really focusing on how we cultivate such a project. And so this is sort of my figure that I'll be coming back to. I think everything really starts with the conditions. What kinds of conditions are we creating? And then from there, only when we've created the sustainable conditions for successful and sustainable growth can we really start to think about planting the seeds and then move more into the caring and the protecting phase of work. And I also think about this as a cycle. It's never really ending. Okay, so what are some of the conditions that are required? First and foremost, going back to Supernat et al.'s very important text, Archaeologies of the Heart. I think this is one of the biggest hurdles in academic community collaborative work. A lot of academics are trained to think with their minds all the time. I know that I often live in my head and hyperanalyze things. But when we're talking about community-based work, we're talking about people. And people connect really through feeling. They don't necessarily, we're not robots. We're not connecting just with our brains. And so one of the most important things is to connect with our own heart. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And so I thought we could do a little interactive here. I'm going to turn off my camera in a moment. This is something I try to do with a lot of my students as well. We live in a lot of distraction and a lot of oppression and violence, and it's very easy to kind of be caught up in all of the stress. And so one of the most important things that I think we can do starting out is to calm our minds, settle our minds, and make space for that connection so that we can connect with other people. So I recommend for starting out, you can focus on your breath. You can also add some visualization if you're interested. One visualization is to imagine you're exhaling all distraction, anxiety, and negative states of mind. And in the process, as you inhale, imagine you're inhaling warm, healing light, and that light kind of pervades and soothes your body and calms you down. And we can do this for 5 to 10 minutes every day or as often as needed. And it's one way that I think we can go into some of these conversations with a more heart-centered mind. So I'm going to cut off my camera, and I invite everyone to join me for 3 or 4 exhalations. Okay, so that's one way. And in the text that I shared, there's also another meditation and breathing practice that they share. So there are lots of options there. Once we, I think, are in a more, we have more clarity of mind, then we can start to think about, well, what are our intentions? Some of the common intentions, and again, this is one of the hardest, I think one of the biggest obstacles within the academy. One of the most common intentions that I hear, people are really concerned about their own reputation, their own CV, their own careers, and financial gain. And that's not to say that 2 things cannot be true. I think we can look out for ourselves and also have intentions that are community-centered. But we really need to get honest with ourselves about what those intentions are and which ones are the most important. Some of the less common ones that I think we could think about more, like I mentioned previously, maybe one goal is to help people connect with their heritage. One of the things that I think about with relation to the African archaeological record is stewardship. These sites are incredibly understudied and at risk of total destruction. And so for me, I would say that's one of my primary intentions in community-based work, is to help steward some of these sites. And then the last condition really that I'm going to talk about today is really the reflexive part. And this is something we could talk about for hours. But thinking about, you know, how has power historically been distributed in this particular field site or research center, and where does that researcher fit within that? So when I'm working in Tanzania, we're dealing with decades of colonial legacies. I'm a white woman from the United States. I'm seen as having a lot of inherent wealth and power. So how do I navigate that? And then I'd say this is one of my favorite questions to ask my students. Who are you performing for and why? So this kind of goes back to the intention that we talked about. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of who is our audience. But, you know, I think getting really serious and really detailed about who we're trying to focus our attention on is very important. Okay, I'm going to try to speed through the last couple of slides here. So some of the seeds that we can plant really relies on connection, basically. So how do we connect? I'd say first, one great way is to learn the language. I'm happy to answer questions about how I became a Swahili speaker. The second, I think, important thing is to know your history, especially if you're doing international field work. Know the history that is really palpable in people's memory today. Some of the ways we've done this in the Kondoa project is through formal presentations. We have regular community meetings underneath the tree that are open to everyone. We have meetings with the elected leadership, and we also have our excavation and lab is always open to visitors at all times. And we do quite a bit of school visits as well. Okay, in terms of the caring and the protection, really the cultivation, the raising side of things, we can think about sharing power and then what does co-produced work look like. So here I just have a photo of one of the ways that we try to share power is by creating systems in which decision-making is equally distributed, and also creating situations where I'm not always the person in charge. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A and how we do that on the day-to-day. And in terms of the co-produced part, I just wanted to mention quickly that sometimes that, and at times that will be at odds with what an academic agenda might be. And so in this case, when we started speaking with the Machinjioni village community, they were really interested in a school. And so we've tried to think about how we can also help leverage resources towards the benefits that the local community really wants to see. And I think that means that sometimes we have to be okay with the fact that our academic goals might be lower priority. Okay, so quickly to just summarize, there's a lot of community-centered work that has led to the current moment. Communities are cultivated, they're built, they're not found, they take time, active investment. And I encourage everyone to remember to breathe throughout. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your attention. Thank the Machinjioni village community, many collaborators in Tanzania and around the world, and many funding agencies who made this work possible. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ranhorn. And now we'll move to and again, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So we're going to move to our second speaker, Dr. Elaine Guevara, who is a lecturer in evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. Her research investigates sensory and dietary ecology and on understanding the processes of aging. At Duke University, she's also helped to develop and disseminate free undergraduate education resources to teach human genetics without inadvertently reinforcing false and harmful conceptions of race and human difference. Dr. Guevara.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me and see my slides? Okay, thanks. So yeah, I also want to start by thanking Rob so much for organizing this, and other participants for sharing their really great work. So today I am going to be talking about the importance of how we teach about genetics and why that matters, not only for our students, but I think to society more generally. So my goal is to convince you that genomic literacy has never been more important, and we should all be doing everything in our power to promote it. I will note that this is going to be tough. I've timed this, and I'm going to try to be as cognizant as possible as the time, but I do get time blindness sometimes in these situations. So maybe Rob can, or someone can let me know if it seems like I'm not wrapping up in like the right amount of time. Okay, so without further ado, let's start by setting the stage. It's 2024 and genomic science is speeding ahead, and it has been for at least a decade, and it is of increasing relevance to our lives. It's, for people like me who do genetics, really exhilarating, honestly. But unfortunately, there is also a bit of a dark side, because this also happens to be a time where misinformation has become really pervasive and is doing a lot of harm, sowing mistrust, deepening divisions, and so forth. And today I'm really going to focus on a particular kind of misinformation about human variation that, for convenience, I'm going to call race realism, a kind of scientific racism that is unfortunately currently resurgent and involves often the weaponization of human genomics research and data itself to make a really old argument about white biological superiority. So this is really concerning, because this is a really dangerous idea. History is very clear. On the surface, it is also really odd, because in the genomics era, the core ideas of race realists, so namely that biological races exist, and that human phenotypes are simple, have simple heritable bases, even complex things like intelligence and behavior, they're harder than ever to entertain these ideas when we have a clearer than ever idea of just how complex and multifactorial human phenotypes are, and no more than we ever have in the past about the geographic distribution of human genetic variation. And it doesn't meaningfully break down into racial clusters, right? So I'm preaching to the choir here, but anyway, it makes absolutely no scientific sense. These arguments should be resurgent, and I think for a lot of mainstream scientists, this tends to be something that we write off as occurring on the festering fringes of the internet, the dark corners we don't like to visit, and so it's sort of best left unaddressed. But my thinking about this has changed, because I've seen research showing that teenagers and young people, solely by virtue of the very large amount of time they spend online and engaging on user content sharing platforms, will be exposed to these ideas. That's how prevalent they've become on platforms like YouTube. Okay, so the other important thing in this pernicious mix is that genetics education is really outdated at the secondary level and often even at the college level. And so in particular, Mendelian and classical genetic models continue to dominate textbooks, and though they are historically important, they're not what most students actually need, which is a practical understanding of the genetic contribution to human phenotypes, not the genetic contribution to the phenotypes of inbred, laboratory, or domesticated organisms, or their hybrid cross offspring. So these models can lead students to believe mistakenly that most human traits are monogenic, of high penetrance, and follow a simple inheritance pattern, which is simply not consistent with empirical data for humans or any other natural population. But this lack of genetic literacy is exactly how race realists can make arguments that make no scientific sense in the 21st century. So they really rely on this. Okay, and crucially, pedagogy research actually demonstrates that being taught widespread textbook genetics curricula itself can increase students' racial essentialism. I just dropped a couple links in the chat. So it can increase beliefs that races are real and essentially different types of people. So this isn't just hypothetical, it actually really matters. So what I'm trying to lay out here is that teaching what I call mediocre information, so like using only examples of monogenic traits to teach about how genotype influences phenotype, allows for common misconceptions about human variation to persist And as a consequence, that allows disinformation to take root. And race realists are in some ways smart. I mean, they really do actually use these types of common misconceptions, like about the racial nature of sickle cell or lactose tolerance, to purposely lure people in. So that is all a big downer. But there is really good, hopeful news, and that is that research also shows that teaching the true, wonderful complexity of genetics decreases students' racial essentialism. So I'm attempting to drop another link in here. So this is why how we teach isn't just important for avoiding negative consequences, but it's actually a really promising intervention for a more equitable society. Most people will take a biology class, if not, maybe a bioanth class. So for these reasons, some colleagues and I decided to try to develop some more relevant 21st century teaching modules to help teach human genetics, to combat misinformation and increase genomic literacy in our classes, and possibly to share with others. So there are currently 4 topics, and the first link I think I dropped actually leads to them, and they can be used as a series, although the order of the first 2 doesn't really matter. I actually teach them the opposite, Intro to Bioanth. And they can also be used separately, although Ancestry kind of relies on the first 2. But anyway, I'm going to next briefly provide an overview of the module. So for time, this is probably going to be a little rough, but to just give you some sense, but you can also check them out at your leisure, of course, which is probably more effective. But yeah, so the first module is on human evolutionary genetics, and it covers the major events in human evolutionary history that have produced the current geographic patterns of human variation that we see. And so this is pretty familiar to most people here, but not something taught in most non-anthrop courses in my experience. So we discuss our species history, having been in Africa for the most part, and then the relatively recent and rapid expansion of founder populations out of Africa, resulting in serial founders effects and decreasing genetic diversity with distance from Africa, as well as how migrations following the initial peopling of the globe resulted in continuing gene flow, particularly among neighboring regions, and then also more occasionally over longer distances throughout much of the later Pleistocene and Holocene, resulting in a pattern that geneticists call isolation by distance in genetic structure. And then also how these patterns, ongoing gene flow, recent geographic shared origins, mean that most human genetic diversity is shared across human populations from different geographic regions versus being what geneticists call private or particular to one population or region. And then the genotype-phenotype module starts with all the basics, DNA, et cetera, and then builds up to discuss polygenicity, penetrance, environmental influence. And the key ideas here are really that even simple traits that we are often taught are Mendelian, like eye color, are polygenic, and most, if not all, traits are also influenced by the environment. And a major goal for this module is for the relationship between genotype and phenotype to not be a black box for students. Okay. The next module is the Ancestry module. And the reason we made this module is because Ancestry tests are actually the largest or most common contact point for most people in the US with genetics. So the module starts out by defining relatedness, because relatedness, and specifically relatedness of the test taker to individuals in predefined geographic reference groups, is what Ancestry tests actually measure. Then we talk about how, because most, again, genetic variation and most haplotypes are shared across multiple geographic regions, test takers often have very similar relatedness to multiple different reference groups, which makes Ancestry assignment pretty low confidence. And this is why twins, kind of famously in the media, or even the same person taking the same test twice, can get different results. But probably more importantly, even like putting aside all the technical limitations of Ancestry testing, if we could do it perfectly, the probably most important point is that Ancestry doesn't naturally group people into continental groups. The continental level results you get are simply the byproduct of how your relatedness to reference groups is binned to continent in a way that is ultimately arbitrary. It's just meant to help people more quickly understand their results. And so that's understandable from a communications perspective, but it's also really unfortunate because continental ancestry is often assumed to be a proxy for race. So there we go again, confusingly seeming to implicitly reaffirm the reality of biological races. And where the rubber really meets the road is around ancestry and medicine, where the term ancestry has been really embraced because, once again, that shared genetic variation includes medically relevant genetic variation, like variants in enzymes that determine how you metabolize drugs. And you need to know your genotype. The use of continental level ancestry is not informative, and in my opinion, is a step away from rather than towards personalized medicine. And I will try to actually I didn't grab the link for this paper first, and I actually don't use it in the module, but this is a paper that explains really nicely. It's pretty short about how socially defined populations vary in medically relevant genotypes. Okay, another common misconception about ancestry is that it reflects historical human stocks, like back when we were purebred, but humans were never purebred, right? We actually were never pea plants or any other kind of domesticate or lab animal. So all ancestry is mixed ancestry, just from further back. Ancestry is inherently time-bounded and specific to a particular time. And ancestry isn't very representative of your deep ancestors. It can only tell you very much about who else you're related to that you may share ancestors with in the last 300 years. So that's really interesting to a lot of people, don't get me wrong, but it's just not necessarily what people think, right? And finally, the last module is different on scientific racism. It is covering the history of scientific racism, so it might work better in some classes than others, but we wanted to create this research as a way to show how scientific racism has been perpetuated over the years and its impact on society more broadly, as well as the evidence against it that have always been there at every point in history, and those who have struggled against, and that there have been people who've struggled against race science, right? So one of the main takeaways is for students to see race as the zombie idea that it is. That's a term that I think originally comes from economics, and I'm quoting from a psychologist now, but a zombie idea is an idea that has been thoroughly refuted by a mountain of empirical evidence, but nonetheless refuses to die, being continually reanimated by our deeply held beliefs. So the timeline is helping students refute two common narratives that they otherwise often endorse or encounter. One, that everyone in the past used to hold mistaken beliefs, and now we all know better. That's not the case. The persistence of scientific racism is a testament to how motivated cognition, rather than evidence, leads people to endorse it, and people have always fought against it. And also, too, that race realism is most certainly not a brave new idea that some outspoken blogger or podcaster or YouTuber uncovered. I think this is so familiar to a lot of us that we take it for granted, but we have to remember that our students, these are ideas that I often sort of hear from students. Okay, so I actually can't see my time at all, so please let me know if I'm running over terribly. I'm moving into the final conclusions here, but yes, so our hope is that students can have a 21st century genomics education, and of course that's not just for combating race realism, it's also to help them navigate healthcare decisions, etc. But there is a growing area of behavioral science actually looking at how to combat the spread of misinformation. And there's this concept called pre-bunking, which is basically debunking, but before you encounter the misinformation. And so I kind of see this as a form of pre-bunking around human variation. And another analogy that people often use in the sort of misinformation space is about vaccines and inoculation. So the ultimate goal, of course, of this is also that, to prevent the spread of viral misinformation. I want to say I'm a pretty cynical person, and I have no illusion that it would be easy to get all college, let alone high school genetics classes to cover this kind of content. And even if they did, it's not going to work all the time. It's not going to reach all the students. Some of them, because of these psychological phenomenon that we're aware of, we know motivated cognition is more important than empirical evidence when it comes to people's worldviews, especially about their social identity. But I do think the evidence we have from pedagogical research suggests this is really worthwhile in young people to decrease racial essentialism. And so genomics literacy is really worth pursuing. And I think starting with college students or having that be part of it is still really helpful because our students will be future teachers, in some cases future physicians. Certainly a lot of pre-med students take Intro to Bioanth. So the more of them that are inoculated, the less these misconceptions will spread. So there's perhaps hope for herd immunity. So yeah, what can we do? So of course, a lot of this is about how we teach, right? And so yes, we can teach a more 21st century genetics in our classroom. We can teach better about human variation. We can also do that in our outreach. And we're right now doing an assessment of the basic effectiveness of these modules in Intro to Bioanth in a few classrooms this semester. And if you teach Intro to Bioanth or biology or anything similar, you're welcome to join. And so that was one of the links that I put to a Google form. So yes, that's also what this QR code goes to. So you're welcome to get involved and help us out. That would actually be really, really welcome and great. And yes, the modules are available online. You don't need to necessarily use them all. I think it would still be really helpful to see how people might want to use them. I'm also really happy to share these slides to anyone interested, like these overview slides, so to help get the message out about why this matters. And I'm happy to talk to people about this more whenever, wherever. There's a lot to say. It's really hard to condense this so much, actually. So my email address is on here. A couple other things I wanted to mention. There is good reason, though, to think that like younger students, it's going to be more effective. So high school, more people go to high school and they're younger and are more likely to have not encountered this information yet. So I do think that's a critical locus of intervention. And I think standardized tests, even though a lot of us disparage them, they could be a blessing here, especially like AP biology, because it does sort of force the standardization and updating of curricula. So I think AP Bio has to change, and then textbooks are another place that are really important. So I do want to, I guess, end on a hopeful note. I think this actually is not an unreasonable change to push for. There's so many reasons to push for this. And so let me just finish by thanking my colleagues and also all the people whose shoulders I stood on in doing this work. So Brian Donovan is really the main researcher who's done a lot of the pedagogy really at the heart of this, really amazing work. So absolutely him. And then a lot of other people have worked on issues sort of around this, like Dr. Joseph Graves Jr., Gregory Raddick, Adam Rutherford, Sharman Royal here at Duke. And then, yes, I will just trail off with saying all of you for your attention and interest, and to Rob and other presenters and all my colleagues and supporters and funding sources. So thank you very much. I hope that didn't go on terribly long.
No worries. Thank you, Elaine. And yeah, when we scheduled this, I fully anticipated that we might run over, so that's okay. So again, we will have Q&A at the end. Please feel free to post questions in chat, and we will get to them as we can. We're not going to move to our last speaker. Dr. Esha Lewis is the project director for the Public Scholars Training Program, Public Scholars Training Fellowship Program at Sapiens Magazine, a program to support anthropologists in developing accessible writing and podcasting skills for broad non-academic audiences. She has conducted ethnographic research projects and written about them in Peru on Afro-Peruvian activism, identity and inequality, and the role of race and violence against women. Dr. Lewis.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I would also like to start off by thanking Rob and Brett, everyone at the ABA, for inviting me. Even though I was like, I'm a cultural anthropologist, I don't know what I can do for you, but I come bearing gifts, which I will get to shortly. Thank you as well to Elaine and Katie for your presentations. This has been very interesting for me to learn from you as well, and to just see the other kinds of work that are taking place. This is a big effort to try to get anthropological knowledge out into the rest of the world and do good with it. So thank you for your efforts. I know it's not always easy. So I'm going to get my presentation lined up for you here, and then I'm going to talk a bit about what Sapiens does, and talk about public writing skills. For those of you who don't know Sapiens, we are a anthropological digital magazine. We are a team full of anthropologists, so you'd be working, and I guess if we were to compare it to the process of writing for a journal, everyone that you're working with is an anthropologist who is dedicated to helping you translate your research into writing that a general public can access. There is no firewall, so anyone with an internet connection can read your work. And I'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of that, but basically, we see this as being really important precisely because anthropologists are doing such important work, and we really want to help get it out there to people who perhaps, for whatever reason, didn't have the time or the resources to dedicate such an incredible amount of time to the study, but who could deeply benefit from understanding more about what it is that you do. So Sapiens Magazine was created in 2016 by our editor-in-chief, Chip Colwell, who's still there with us chugging along. And we have an editor who works on linguistic and cultural anthropology, and someone else who works on archaeology and bioanthropology as well. So you'd be in excellent hands if you chose to write with us. But I will also be talking about the benefits of trying to get your work out to the many public outlets that are available to you. So why write for the public? So Katie mentioned Gombe and Jane Goodall, Dr. Jane Goodall, and I'm going to start there as well. So 1960, Dr. Jane Goodall, well, Jane Goodall at the time, ends up in Tanzania doing this, what would become very, very important research on chimps. And she finds that chimpanzees are making and using tools, which is a huge discovery for the scientific world, those who study animal behavior, for anthropologists, of course. And almost immediately, Jane Goodall says, I want to take this out of academia. It's obviously a very important discovery for my field and my discipline, but people around the world need to know about this. And I think at Sapiens, this is something that we very much believe in as well. Getting your work out and in front of as many eyes as possible. So there are a number of prompts throughout this, but I suppose the first one would be a call to reflection for everyone here to think about what knowledge you want to have outside of the ivory tower, outside of academia. What kind of difference do you want to make? Because that's a real important driving question to help you figure out how to go about doing this. Now, Sapiens is one of a number of different public outlets that offer scientific knowledge. That would be, probably very happy to receive a pitch from you to learn about your work. So we are obviously one that focuses on anthropology, but there are a number. There are some that are global. There are others that are regional, national, local. There are a lot of different outlets that would be willing to publish work by anthropologists, and that do. If we were to ask ourselves why write for Sapiens, it says Sapiens, but this could just as well be about writing anywhere, just in general. Once your work is out in front of a broader public, there's an opportunity for republication. So a lot of these publications have someone who is dedicated to scouring the internet, seeing what kind of research has already been published and republishing them. So people have been republished in The Atlantic or Scientific American or in Discover Magazine. Their work has been translated. They're invited to speak on podcasts. Some people have ended up with book deals. They've been nominated and nominated for and won prizes. we're increasingly seeing some advances in having public writing support tenure packages, which obviously we think is a very big deal. We know, especially for people who are on the tenure track, it can be a big deterrent to write for the public if you feel that that is not going to be taken into consideration when it's time for you to be considered for tenure. So, we do hope to see that change moving forward. But ideally, what you really get to do is share your research and your ideas, not only with the communities that you work with, right, who may not be able to access or to decipher an academic article, but people around the world who may identify with a number of the different topics that you're working on. Something that's not mentioned here, but that's also important is policy. Some people have been called into talks about, policy on climate or the weather. We're thinking about human interaction. So that's something to think about as well. So I'm going to walk through some of the principles that Sapiens Magazine uses when trying to figure out how to go about this translation process, how to take this very rigorous research you've done and turn it into something that someone that, an intelligent audience member can understand. So number one, audience. Tom Radford, who's a Guardian editor, once said that when you sit down to write, there's only one important person in your life. This is someone you will never meet, called the reader. So it's important for you to have a sense of who your reader is. Every publication caters to their own audience, right? So you do want to know things like age, how old are they? What is the gender distribution? Where are they located? Why are they reading? Do they want to just find out something interesting? Are they looking for a laugh? Do they need a link to share with someone who they're having a debate or a conversation with? It's very important to know this because this is an excellent example of this. So you can see different topics written about for different audiences in different magazines, right? So this would be an example of Cosmopolitan and The Economist covering the problem with cosmetics, right? Obviously from different standpoints because they're thinking about their audience. What is going to be most interesting for them? And that's going to help you to figure out how you should construct your story. At Sapiens, we also keep an eye on who our readers are. We know that we are predominantly read by US public. The gender split skews a bit more to people who identify as male. We also know that people read us a lot on their cell phones. So that is something to also consider. Sometimes someone's not sitting down all the time, with 2 hours worth of time to read through what you're writing. They might be on the train or in the doctor's office. So that factors into the way that we think about writing. So think about who you want to write for and where you would reach them. You can go online, you can talk to people, you can find outlets that speak to you where you think that your writing would best fit. You also want to avoid anthro-speak. This is quite complicated because as you have learned to write in anthro-speak, you also have to learn how to write for the public. When we think about jargon, we're talking about very specialized language. So language that people within your group can understand. Jargon gets a bad rep, but it can be very, very useful if you're part of this inner group to really share your ideas very quickly, to use shorthands. It's quite efficient. However, if you are not part of this group, it's very difficult to get past jargon, right? It's this language that people can't understand, they feel intimidated by, they feel shut out or alienated by. Sometimes it kind of just puts people to sleep and it stops them from being able to understand what it is that you rightfully want to say to them. So doing the work of reflecting on the kind of language you're using is going to be really important. There is scientific research that would show that jargon leads to bad science and bad science communication. And so what you really want to do is try to combat that by thinking through the terms you're using and seeing if your friend who does not study what you are studying understands you, if your parent, if someone else you work with who's even working on something else has any clue what you're saying. This is going to be very important. We really want to simplify complexity. This does not mean you want to dumb down your science or your research, but again, as I've said, you do have to assume that people who are reading your work are not experts the way you are. And so you want to take them by the hand and walk them through your ideas, instead of jumping to conclusions or jumping further down the road and then risking losing them behind. You assume that your reader is intelligent, but not as informed as you are. I think that's a good way to think about this. We talk a lot about heart before head. I think Katie also mentioned this in her presentation as well. This is an image that people who've worked with us might be familiar with. When you look at this image, there's a lot, usually for most people, there are a lot of questions that come to mind immediately. What is going on? Why is this child being passed through barbed wire? Are they okay? Is there imminent danger? Where are they? There are all of these details that become hooks in a way, right? This is a way that you can draw people into your story by presenting them with an image or presenting them with a scenario that helps them want to engage with what you're saying that goes beyond the facts. The facts are very important, but to get someone interested, immediately, you really kind of want to find a way to capture their attention. We had an author, for example, Ben Bellick, who wrote about the history of blood donation. And he started off by talking about his, at the time, quite young son who got very sick, and who was diagnosed with the disease and then treated through a blood transfusion and who got better, right? So this is the kind of entry point that you can use to get someone who may know nothing about, blood donors, but who can perhaps empathize with, having a very sick child or wanting to understand why. Why is it that this, transfusion made all of the difference, right? That becomes your entry point. So you want to ask yourself how you can start to think about your work in a way that will encourage you to, or encourage your reader to move their heart before their head. This is a really tricky one. I will admit that I struggle with this a lot. Sharing one big idea. Readers have very short attention spans. When we think about it, we are now inundated with information that comes at us online, from emails to spam to pop-ups to, texts. People are, and as in the case of Sapiens, we know that people are reading us on their phones already, which means that they're likely going to be distracted in any given moment by something else. You have a very short amount of time to pull people in. So that's why, picking one idea is one way to not distract your reader. You want to focus on one main idea and draw them in, and you want to do it quickly. We don't want to leave all the suspense to the end, because they may not make it to the end. You really have to do the work to make sure that you're capitalizing on the amount of time that you have. Also, you have a lot less words at your disposal when you are writing, maybe a 20, 30 page academic article. People are a bit more flexible with the word count. You're probably going to be looking at somewhere between 18 to 2,500 words. So you don't have time to get into every single, corner of your work. You want to talk about one idea. And then again, coming back to this idea of simplicity over complexity to really make it easier on yourself too. We encourage people to think about this as Star Wars, where you have this entire universe of different people and different stories. And if you were to try to make one big Star Wars movie with every single plot line in it, it would probably be an absolute disaster. So you want to focus on one movie at a time, one idea, one storyline at a time, so that your reader is content and that you can focus in on what exactly it is you want to convey. So think about one big idea that you most want to share. What are you most excited about? What is perhaps being talked about the most in the media at this time? Is there a major scientific debate about some aspect of work that your work ties into? Think about one big idea and work on that. Try your best to confront your fears. Ralph Keyes wrote that fear is felt by writers at every level. Anxiety accompanies the first word they put on the page and the last. Writing is very, very anxiety inducing. So we encourage writers to figure out what works best for you. Do you need to find some sort of refrain that you can hold on and just repeat to yourself to get you to put the word on the page? Can you reward yourself in some way? Is there a cookie you like that you will eat if you get through one paragraph? Is there a structure or a time of day that works for you? Figure out what you need to do to just put one foot ahead of the other and start working. It can be very, very difficult to do this, but it does end up being worth it. And lastly, you really want to tell a story. We talk a lot about the difference between topics and stories at the magazine. So, you know, a topic in this case might be, well, we're in a biological anthropology event, so let's go with the Raramuri. We had someone cover Daniel Lieberman, who went to Mexico to participate in a 12-hour running ceremony with this indigenous group in Mexico. That is a story. The topic is this idea of Raramuri, this is the indigenous group, being super runners, right? So climate change is a topic. The story is about someone in this, you know, someone interacting with or living out something that has to do with your topic. So you want to write a story that is about a topic, not just about your topic. And that can be quite tricky because you're kind of used to thinking of one or the other. Your topic is what you work on. The story is what is going to captivate people. So what is an example of a way that you can go from a topic to your story in your work? And finally, just remembering that the elements of a story are really important to keep in mind. And these are, of course, these sort of skills that you learn about writing as time goes on. But you want to give it an arc. You want to talk about imperfect characters. You want to present some sort of tension point. There's something wrong. There's an obstacle, right? There's this sort of climactic moment, perhaps. There's an issue. There's a end point where there's either resolution or maybe just a point of learning or extra frustration, but some sort of change, right? Trying to capture the change over time in what you're doing is really important. And to close, I just want to remind everyone that as anthropologists, storytelling is deeply human. And so in writing for the public, you are engaging in this very, very old practice of sharing experiences and knowledge. And so that might be something that might hearten you as well to write. So I'm going to end here. This is my information. We also do, as I mentioned, have an excellent editor who works on bioanthropology and archaeology, who would be just, I'm sure she would absolutely love to work with anyone who's interested. And I'm happy to share as well some of my, some links if they're useful about both the program that I run and the magazine, if you are looking for more information on pitching specifically to us. But I will stop there. Thank you so much. Rob, I will hand it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. So we do have a few minutes for questions before we jump to breakout rooms. I do want to have a chance for people to kind of share and learn with each other. One question came up, which I think is an important one, asking about noting that it's great that Sapiens does not have a firewall. In saying that, how are authors compensated for their work? And we can expand that more broadly, thinking about like what incentives are there in place to support people doing publicly engaged scholarship?
So Sapiens pays authors to write. We offer $250 American for per article. And then you can also check, because it does vary from publication to publication. A lot of the larger ones pay as well. It usually depends on what you're writing, how long it is, you know, the editorial process that goes into it. But yes, there are people who make their living, you know, writing for the public in one way or another. So there are monetary rewards, is what I'm trying to say, for writing, in addition to what you can get for yourself as a scientist and as someone who's putting themselves out there.
Thank you for that. I wanted to maybe modify the question somewhat for Elaine and Katie to just to reflect a little bit on sort of how do benefits of publicly engaged scholarship maybe reach communities in the case of Katie's presentation, or the benefits of this sort of kind of more engaged pedagogy, how does that impact maybe teachers and departments? So maybe Katie, if you could go first.
Can I just clarify, you're saying not how are the communities benefiting? You're asking how are...
Yes, how communities benefit from sort of a community, what are some tangible impacts that a community-centered approach can have? And you talked about the school, like that being a particular focus, but I think it's important. And why I raise this is because I think that there's kind of a very abstract, well, everyone wants to know, right? But also people have very immediate needs sometimes, and to what extent is our work intersecting with that?
Yeah, I've talked about this in the past. It's something that we try to focus on with the co-produced part from the beginning, is really think, okay, what do all of the people here want to get out of this? What are the benefits that they see? The school is one example. The one that we hear often is about hiring people, right? Giving jobs, financial benefits. Another thought has to do with the sort of training and the skills that people can have to build their careers, sometimes go on to academia, for example. Something else that we do in Condoa is we try to make sure that all of the food supplies that we buy are from that local village instead of bringing things from a big city. How can we invest in the community financially as much as possible? So I think that there are a lot of benefits, and that's really thinking about where I work specifically. And then tourism is, I would say, the broader context in which this is all happening. So we have an important role to play, I think, in shaping kind of the public narrative about some of these sites, and encouraging more people to come to visit. But within that, how do we make sure that the tourism is more sustainable and that the local communities are benefiting, right? And it's not just going, for example, to the parks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then, so Elaine, thinking about impacts on educators or impacts on departments, I know that your project is fairly new, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think the broader impact is clear. That's the whole motivation for the project. And I guess I'm not totally sure what the impact is for educators exactly, besides just the reward of maybe teaching something that's interesting. But I guess I'll take this airtime to just maybe address some of the reasons people wouldn't want to update the curriculum. Because people definitely do respond to this as I already find teaching genetics really challenging. I don't want to be teaching this thing that's really complex and that I don't have the background in. And so I guess from my point of view, also people don't really like to be told what to teach, at the college level. But I think in my having talked to people about this a little bit, actually, a lot of people are I've wanted to teach differently for ages. There just aren't good resources. That was part of the motivation. But also, I think part of the reason teaching genetics is so hard is because it doesn't make a lot of sense to our students or for us when we teach it, because of the way our textbook genetics curriculum is. It doesn't match up with what we observe or current research. So I actually think the benefit would be just greater cognitive coherence. I had to cut from my slides is talking about that, but for instructors and for students. And that's, something that we all enjoy as teachers, is that aha moment where our students are things are clicking and we get it and stuff. So I think it also is just, more interesting and fun.
Yeah.
Teaching evolution.
Okay, so that was the only immediate question I saw. So I think that given that we have about 15 minutes left, I do want to jump into breakout rooms. So these will be just random groups of people who are attending here. The idea is just to share a little bit about your reflections, any things that you'd like to share more broadly. We will put a Google Jamboard in chat. And I do want to make sure if any our speakers are invited to join, but if anyone has to leave, including Dr. Lewis, just wanted to make sure we say thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your time and expertise. Really appreciated. And I hope people will check out the Sapiens Public Scholar program. And I did want to note that your colleague is presenting at the AABA meeting about science writing, so that would be an opportunity to learn more about the program. So thank you so much to everyone. So we will jump into breakout rooms now and then return for a very brief sharing out at the end. I think we'll aim for 10 minutes, Brett, if that sounds good. And there's some prompts
Sure.
in the chat.
How many breakout rooms would you like?
So we have 20 some people here, so I think 4 or 5 probably is good. People may start
Okay.
dropping off too.
I'm going to do 4, and
Yeah.
you're going to be automatically assigned, everyone. So here we go. Make new friends.